Rome wasn't defeated by a single blow. It wasn't a grand cinematic battle that ended the greatest empire in history. It was something much more modern and much more terrifying. Rome was put on a subscription plan. Every year, as the sun crossed the horizon, a massive shipment of gold left the imperial vaults in Constantinople. This wasn't the result of a lost war on a single, blood-soaked field. It wasn't the result of a city falling to a siege. It was a calculated, cold-blooded financial transaction. Rome paid because it literally could not afford the alternative. This wasn't tribute in the traditional sense. It was a system, a financial architecture designed by an empire that had no permanent cities, no central banks, and no economy that a Roman tax collector could even begin to measure. While Rome was busy building walls of stone to protect what they owned, the Huns were building a network of influence to control how everyone else moved. They realized a truth that modern tech giants wouldn't discover for another 1,500 years. If you control the friction of a system, you control the wealth of that system. So how do you build world-dominant power without a single piece of physical infrastructure? How do you command the gold of the world when you don't even have a place to store it? Today we analyze the Huns, not as a horde of barbarians, but as history's most successful and most lethal asset-light superpower. To understand why Rome failed, you have to understand how Rome thought. Rome believed that power had to be visible to be real. They built roads that stretched across 3 continents, stitching the world together with stone. They constructed amphitheaters and forums designed to last for 1,000 years. They created tax systems so rigid and bureaucratic that they could be counted, audited, and stored in marble vaults. In the Roman mind, if power didn't have a physical shape, it didn't exist. But the Huns? They operated in the cloud of the 5th century. They didn't stay still long enough to be mapped, and that was their primary competitive advantage. You see, if a system has no fixed coordinates, it cannot be besieged. If it has no supply lines, it cannot be cut off. If it has no capital city, there is no heart to pierce. What Rome saw as nomadic chaos was actually a masterclass in what we today call low operating leverage. Rome was a company with massive fixed costs. They had thousands of miles of walls to maintain, tens of thousands of legions to feed, and a sprawling bureaucracy that consumed a staggering percentage of their annual GDP. Every mile of border they added didn't just add power, it increased their maintenance cost exponentially. The Huns, by contrast, had almost zero overhead. Their infrastructure wasn't made of stone. It was made of social contracts, biological speed, and psychological terror. By removing the weight of cities and the friction of governance, they maximized their velocity. They didn't build roads. They turned the entire Eurasian steppe into a high-speed highway where they were the only ones who knew the exit ramps. They proved that in a fight between the heavy and the fast doesn't need to win every battle. They just need to make the heavy's existence too expensive to maintain. Every empire in history depends on some form of infrastructure. For Rome, the road was the artery of the state. For the Huns, they replaced the road with something far more efficient: continuous, uninterrupted movement. A Hunnic warrior didn't just have a horse, he operated a biological hardware system. Each rider traveled with a string of multiple horses, sometimes up to 10. They didn't ride one animal to exhaustion. They rotated them constantly, jumping from one to the next without ever touching the ground. This allowed them to cover distances that were physically impossible for any organized Roman legion. They didn't just travel, they operated a system. They covered distances faster than information itself could move. Think about the implications of that. In the ancient world, information moved at the speed of a horse. But if the enemy is the horse, and they are moving in a relay system, they arrive before the warning does. By the time a Roman messenger arrived at a frontier outpost to warn of a Hunnic sighting, the Huns had often already bypassed that outpost, raided the interior, and vanished into the horizon. This is the ultimate modern parallel. Logistics dominance. Think of Amazon Prime, but instead of delivering consumer goods, they were delivering existential pressure. By controlling the latency of warfare, they controlled the reaction time of their enemies. And in any market, military, political, or financial, if you control the reaction time, you control the final outcome. Rome was playing a game of chess where their opponent was allowed to move 5 times for every one Roman move. It wasn't a lack of courage that defeated Rome. It was a lack of bandwidth. This is the moment where the story shifts from a military history into a financial thriller. The Huns eventually realize something profound. Conquering Rome was actually a terrible business move. Think about it. Conquest is expensive. If you conquer a province, you now own the problems of that province. You have to govern the people. You have to fix the bridges. You have to defend the borders against the next barbarian group. You have to deal with the HR nightmare of a rebellious, tax-hating population. Instead, the Huns did something much more sophisticated. They made Rome calculate risk. Every year, Attila and his envoys would remind the Roman emperor of the cost of uncertainty. They didn't need to burn Constantinople to the ground. They just needed Rome to know that they could. They forced the Roman Senate to sit down and perform a cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost of a full-scale invasion? What is the cost of our trade routes being severed for a decade? What is the cost of the psychological fear spreading through our tax-paying elite? Rome didn't lose a war in the traditional sense. They optimized their losses. They looked at the numbers and realized it was mathematically cheaper to pay a protection fee than to fund a multi-decade war against an enemy they couldn't even find on a map. This was history's first global subscription model. The basic tier of the plan involved paying thousands of pounds of gold every year just to keep the Huns on their side of the Danube. The premium tier involved Rome ceding land and providing supplies on demand. The alternative to the plan was total market volatility, chaos, fire, and the complete disruption of Roman life. Rome chose predictability. They became the Huns' most reliable source of recurring revenue. They were no longer an empire, they were a customer. But where did all that Roman gold actually go? Most historians portray it as mindless looting, barbarians drinking from gold cups in the middle of a field. But if we look at it through the lens of capital allocation, a much more professional picture emerges. The gold didn't sit idle in a vault like it did in Rome. It was liquid. It was used as fuel for the system. Attila used this massive influx of Roman capital to secure his supply chain and manage his labor force. First, he distributed wealth to subordinate tribal leaders. He wasn't just being generous, he was buying market share. He was ensuring that every smaller nomadic group saw more profit in being part of the Hunnic network than in fighting against it. Second, he invested in the system itself, maintaining the vast horse herds and the specialized gear required for high-speed warfare. Third, he used the gold to fund a sophisticated diplomatic corps that kept Rome's other enemies, the Persians, the Goths, the Vandals, distracted or aligned with his interests. In modern terms, this wasn't just spending, it was aggressive reinvestment of revenue into operational growth. The Huns created a perfect feedback loop. The more gold they extracted from Rome, the more they could expand their network. The larger their network, the more pressure they could apply. The more pressure they applied, the more gold they could extract. They didn't need to own the land. They simply needed to influence the behavior of those who lived on it. Trade routes shifted not because of new laws, but because merchants expected the Huns to be there. Armies stayed in their barracks not because they were ordered to, but because they expected a defeat. That is the definition of systemic power, when your enemy changes their behavior before you even show up. But every disruptor has a fatal flaw. Every system that scales too fast eventually hits a bottleneck. For the Hunnic Empire, that bottleneck was a single, non-redundant node: Attila. Attila wasn't just a king, he was the central processing unit of the entire network. He was the only one who held the private keys to the tribal alliances. He was the only one who could coordinate the complex subscription model with the Roman emperors. He was the stability in a system built on movement. In finance and corporate governance, we call this key person risk. Speed scales power, but it often kills long-term stability. Because the Huns had no physical infrastructure, no Senate to deliberate, no written constitution to follow, no permanent banks to manage the flow of capital, there was nothing to hold the network together once the central node went offline. When Attila died unexpectedly in 453 AD, the system didn't just slow down, it vanished. Without his central coordination, the subordinate tribes saw no reason to keep the network alive. The subscription model was canceled. The Roman gold stopped flowing. The Huns didn't leave behind a decaying city or a fallen capital. They simply evaporated back into the grass of the steppe within a single generation. The network was dismantled because the password was buried with the founder. Most empires build monuments of stone to prove they existed. They leave behind ruins for tourists to photograph and cities for future generations to inhabit. The Huns left something much more enduring. They left a model. They taught the world three fundamental lessons about power that are still being used in boardrooms and bunkers today. 1. Remove friction. Don't own the land if you can simply control the movement across it. 2. Control time. If you move faster than your enemy can think, you have already won the battle before it starts. 3. Price uncertainty. Turn your enemy's fear into a recurring revenue stream. That is power in its purest, most abstract form. It is the power of the network over the fortress. It is the power of the cloud over the machine. And while the empire of Attila has been gone for over 1,500 years, the system they pioneered, it never really left us. It just evolved into the invisible systems that run our world today. The Huns didn't just raid Rome. They wrote the code for how modern influence actually works.